I'd like to give a shout out to my Viking brothers. And most of you who have an adverse philosophy, I would like to remind you that I'm quite aware that you take the good with the bad. So I'm going to start off by saying there's a little bit of Floki in all of us. And at the end of the video, I will explain what I mean. And if you think that you are perceptive and insightful, I want you to consider it. Also, I would like you to consider that the cults used to fight each other with martial arts when they had their disagreements. And part of those disagreements were the martial arts they used to fight each other with. In a temple, it is easier to have a bunch of smaller people moving things around. If you were the head of the priesthood, the pharaoh, would you want a bunch of big people in the temple, making it hard to maneuver? Look at the depictions of the Egyptians. They were sort of like a dark Asian. So what you see here is, in the old kingdom, there were big black guys like me, okay, who united it from the south, from Nekhen, okay, from what's called Upper Egypt, because the Nile actually flows from the land of Africa up. So it's like the Nile itself symbolizes the transfer of knowledge up, and this is part of why Satet and Sobek and other Nile deities, including Set, who is said to have killed the Scorpion King, which perhaps is a symbolic death, but almost certainly represents the rivalry of someone who's bigger, perhaps ambushing him in his sleep or in a way that gave him the upper hand. Thus the panther in the cage, the snake in the cage fight, and the caged bird, the sad singing bird, who is in the cage, of some kind of ground animal or being that we see so pervasive in even cartoons when we're younger. So let's talk about this. In politics, we see Horus and Set, or Heru and Set. Okay. One second. Sorry. Oh yes. Okay. We see it because I have notes all over the place. Okay. So in politics, we see Heru and Set. And we see that Set has taken over politics, the three major parties, Democratic, Liberal, and Republican. And this is where the numbers come in. Remember, sacred math department, science, statistics, right? A statistician, Francis Galton, a Mason, Truman, Roosevelt, CIA, OSS. CIA bringing drugs, psychedelic drug movement. Vikings, mushrooms. Look it up. Many people believe they had mushrooms, and then soon it'll come out, and they'll probably find more evidence of it, just like they found more evidence of the blood sacrifices in 2011 when the cults already knew it, because the cults maintain the culture. And if the culture is a Western culture, it is more likely to be maintained because whites had more thorough records after a certain point of time. The Romans kept thorough records. So the cults, and any records that were in the Library of Alexandria represented the Afro-Asiatic perspective of things and their records. So all that survived was the Greco-Roman perspective of the mysteries from Africa and Babylon and what have you. It's one way to look at it. And of course the Asians' records. And so you have the Yorks, and where they confronted the Vikings, and the Scottish Rite, and where they confronted the Vikings, and where the Romans did, and how they learned to live with them. And that's, what it represents, the black and white as well, the threat from the north and the threat from the south. So we look at philosophies, right? First, we must agree to it. This is 4 minutes, okay? First, we must agree that to address the problem, business comes second, and what's best for humanity must come first. For us to even agree on this in a way that is actual and not just stated, okay, it goes back to Horus and Set, presentation versus application. Pretendo weed, pretend martial artist, listen to my argument versus I built the pyramids, and it symbolizes that we won that argument, and it was the argument within ourselves that remains, within Africa, Horus and Set. We already defeated Apep and proved that our martial arts were superior to his serpent. Okay, that's also what it symbolizes. The ancient version of Kung Fu and all this Asian stuff being defeated and the snake slithering off. Okay, then who remains? The jackal who defeated the snake says, hey, I'm better than you are. And so the jackal fights the falcon, and when all is said and done, the falcon prevails. Higher thought, precision, timing, strategy, speed, physical contact. So if we were a temple in ancient Egypt, what temple would we be? Well, I would argue we would be the temple of Apep, and that we slithered off to Rome, and that the Romans successfully snaked people like Julius Caesar out of their rightful place, and that is the crony capitalist consumer society we have today as a result of this corrupt governing class that derives its moral relativism from kind of Platonic eugenic thought, from the 10 tables of Rome to Vikings leaving their kids out in the cold, and to sacrifices, blood sacrifices, which are so pervasive in Greco-Roman and Viking culture. Keep in mind, some Vikings were good people. This is part of the reason I believe you have the Viking series, to say, look, we didn't just have these horrible practices that scared and terrorized you. We didn't just scare the shit out of the monks and force them to accept us. We didn't just marry our way into the royal family and help the Talmudic Jews kill everybody. But some of us are just good people who are related to Vikings, and we want out. We want God. And that's what I'm here for, everybody who wants out of this blood sacrifice nonsense society that we live in. So number one is we must admit that what is right is the light, and it's best for humanity. And we must address philosophy, and the fabricated sciences that they will use to justify their Luciferian doctrine. Number two, we must also accept that businesses shouldn't just crash. We shouldn't just leave these people out in the cold. That's wrong. They're our brothers. They have a problem spiritually, okay? We can't sink to their level and treat them like they treated their own who had a problem physically. And I'm not saying they're horrible people. I'm part Viking, and I am the living proof that all men can find God. I also believe that we are supposed to separate to a large degree. I'll get into that later if I have time. So we must admit that business must continue, can continue to be profitable, and the businesses that are taboo, we'll say, can transition, and perhaps with government grants, into sectors or businesses that are respectable. Porn. Who's not going to like this? The porn guys, the strip clubs, the psych meds, the drug pushers, all the people who have an APEP, poison him, blind him culture. This is why I was having problems with my vision, and I have the prescription to prove it, because it goes back to removing Horus's eye, right, as the way to try to fight him. Poison him with APEP. They're all teaming up on the falcon, right, and the dragon is trying to chase him away as well, because it's the reign of evil. Is one way to look at it, if you were going to describe it using African proverbs and communication techniques, and especially when it comes to religion. But everything in Africa is very much like Egypt. Religion, martial arts, and science are all merged together. Look at agriculture and how the Africans do it. Look at African martial art customs and traditions of fighting for honor, and how they became ubiquitous after the transatlantic slave trade brought them to the Americas, especially places like Rio and in Cuba, where some of the great African fighters remain today, from all heights and shapes and sizes, and different African schools of thought. Okay, so if your body is one type, you want to go to this temple or that temple. Another way to look at it is the temple of Horus represents those of us who actually fight with the enemy, versus the Christians who walk in the light, who just fight with the gospel and defend their family. We actually realize we need to be more assertive in our defense of the body, the mind, the temple, mind, body, and soul. And our women are sleeping with them. They're soft killing our kids. This is self-defense. We have to stop that by any means necessary, as long as it is consistent with sacred morality and we do not become them in the process. We walk in the light. Our argument is in the light. Our martial arts are challenges for everyone, not closed privileged competitions for yuppies who can afford a black belt only, but for anyone who wishes to accept. So here we go. Martial arts scholars on my debate team. So I would like to debate anyone on this, and I would like uncontrolled martial artists to prove my point that we're more sharp, our arguments are sharper, and we were meant to lead. No offense. But this is basically like the mini-me clowns and jesters and the priesthood we left behind when we went out to battle and died. They slowly started having bigger numbers. We started having less. They weaseled their way into the top because we were protecting Egypt, and they were the mini-me's in the temple talking shit while we're gone, obsessed with where things are placed. And eventually they were like, we want his place. Okay, so they're the infrastructure. I covered that. The Pharaoh had all the knowledge, so they didn't have all the knowledge. That's part of the reason why their martial arts aren't as good. In their DNA, this is why it's blood rituals, right? The knowledge of the Vikings, for example, comes from the Vikings. The Greeks, the Romans, the African, Egyptian, Afro-Asiatic knowledge comes from, is encoded, I mean, in the blood, paternal gene expression from the father. God is the father. God separated light from dark. He made man in his image. Then he said, it is not right for him to be alone. Let's give him a suitable helper. That's why it is demonic for them to deny me. And it also is consistent with the ancient kind of eugenic argument versus nature versus the white man's nurture. You know, do you want to look at it from the perspective of Greece and Rome and the cults, or do you want to look at it from this Afro-Asiatic perspective as to how we should reproduce, how we should fight, how we should interact with each other on different levels, biological, social, political, economic, religious interactions? You get the point. So it goes back to fighting with them over philosophy and science. Once we remove the Christian perspective from the video, you have to focus on philosophy and science, and true science. That's why natural medicine is being oppressed by these dogs. And shout out to my good people of all races, and because whites might feel offended by this video, especially whites who died defending the natural medicine movement, and marijuana is connected. We can't let these people put substances in our weed. Anyone in any club that finds them doing that, beat the shit out of them and put I'm gonna leave it up to you what you should do. I take that back. I think, so let me go through my notes real quick. I think I have time. The mysterious Viking Scandinavian homelands, they did a pretty good job. I cross-referenced them slightly, but I could have done a lot more. If you think that you disagree with anything I say, please put in the comments. The mysteries, because I watched some other documentaries and did some quick search. Anyway, the mysterious Viking Scandinavian homelands. 1818, discovering of how the Vikings lived and died with tools, jewels, and wood carvings. Again, this isn't the center of my research. My research covers the history of humanity, so don't start crying if you think I didn't represent your people to a T. You can always have one of them sit next to me and explain, as long as they're not controlled. Viking Norse people, ship with goods, owners needed for afterlife, right? Women who look like my mom narrating, so, these are my notes. I'll put them in the comments too. Referred to as barbarians with elaborate burials that control the Dark Ages. So the Darkest Ages, serpent from the Dark Ages, the serpent from the abyss. Late 700s, upland of Norway, agriculture people with clans, chiefs and little groups, planted grains and vegetables and relied on livestock. So they also wanted to control the grain. It goes back to going against the grain. Well, which grain, right? Which, and which land? Inner Viking wars, tale of Viking warriors, part of the white racist culture. Okay, so there's a white racist culture that came from this, and then there are regular white people who just happen to be proud of who they are, so it gets confusing. I'm just going to put these notes, basically in the comments. I don't have time. Harold fights his way back to Norway to seal the crown. Vikings use clever tricks in conquering Sicily. People beg for mercy. This is part of how they got their way. What better way to coerce people than a bunch of Vikings, having you beg for mercy? And America got that from the Vikings. They got things from the Romans, the Nazis, the Greeks, the Sicilians, the Italians. They took ideas. That's part of what Western culture is. And the main three are the Vikings, the Greeks, and the Romans. This is why Jesus looks Nordic. This is why there's a pyramid on the dollar bill. This goes back to the ancient temple disagreement, and the evidence is all around. You know them by their works. The proof is in the pudding. Okay, like father, like son. Why is that? Why do people feel like they connect to their ancestors? Why do I know better than the people with degrees? Okay, because it's encoded in the DNA, coding, programming, software and hardware. They control the matrix by controlling everyone's on their iPhone and computer, and you're listening to their software and their program. You're being programmed by them while you're using their programs and reacting to visual stimuli and sound and so on. Different stimuli. And it has a certain effect on your genes, and it encodes your genes. Your body is, your genetic code is being changed by the environment. And this is part of why psychiatry downloads environmental factors, okay, and talk about and emphasize the biological dysfunction, which is very slight unless it is extremely dramatic. So they have to gaslight people to confuse them. And I'm almost out of time. So basically, Floki represents those of us who want to connect to God and are looking for him desperately. And there's a little bit of that in all of us, even though I don't agree with his religion in the series. Thank you. So this is from the Guerrilla Warfare Manual, right? The armies. Notice this types of psychological warfare operations in guerrilla war operational areas. On the top, I have it underlined attitudes and behavior of the local population. Guerrillas and auxiliaries and those underground elements assisting the guerrillas. So they admit on record that there are secret societies and underground groups, you know, kind of CIA affiliated and sponsored, corporate sponsored groups. Okay, reinforce belief in the strength of the guerrilla force and in the rightness of their goals. So you see how when I say that God is real and that one should put morality over the state versus one should wave a flag and mindlessly support the state, you know, on that level, it brought in the military, if for nothing else. Think about it. Oh yeah, so this is from the Department of the Army, 2008 or so, much after 9/11.